Dawn slips over the Ardennes on December 17, 1944, the kind of pale, miserable light that makes the snow look even colder than it already is. Out of the fog, a column of German Panthers crawls forward, their armor plates shining with frost, their long barrels sweeping the tree line like they're bored of killing and just waiting for someone to volunteer. Each engine growls in that confident, we own this forest way that Panther crews were famous for. A few hundred yards ahead, buried in a camouflaged scrape, a Sherman crew is doing their best impression of a group of men who absolutely do not want to be here. The gunner whispers that the Panthers are getting closer. The commander mutters something unprintable. And the loader reaches into the ammo rack and hesitates. Then he grabs a round that looks almost identical to the usual stuff, except it's heavier, shinier, and came in a wooden crate marked with more stamps than a passport collector. No one says it out loud, but the thought hangs there. If this doesn't work, we're toast. The commander finally growls, "Send it." The Sherman fires, the recoil kicking through the hull. The shot streaks across the frozen field, punches through the Panther's gun mantlet, and then, against every expectation, the tank doesn't just die. It erupts. A column of flame blasts the turret upward like someone tried to turn the Panther into a jack-in-the-box from hell. The Sherman crew stares, stunned. Panthers don't do that. They aren't supposed to do any of that. So what exactly happened inside that steel giant? How did one mysterious round tear one of the toughest tanks of the war? And where did this so-called special shell really come from? To answer that, we need to rewind the story, because this was no ordinary shot. If you really want to understand why that Panther blew up so dramatically, you have to rewind a few months and meet the Panther on its best day, because this thing didn't earn its reputation by accident. Imagine a tank designed by engineers who took one look at the Soviet T-34, sighed dramatically, and said, "Fine, we'll make our own version, but angrier." The result was a 45-ton slab of German confidence rolling on tracks. The first thing crews noticed was the armor. 80 millimeters on the front, laid back at an angle sharp enough to make geometry teachers proud. When you added that slope, the effective thickness jumped to something Sherman crews would politely describe as nope. Rounds that should have punched through simply skated off, leaving the Panther looking annoyed rather than damaged. And then there was the gun. The long 75mm KK-42 could hit accurately at distances where a Sherman gunner basically needed binoculars and a miracle. Panther crews loved taking long-range shots, not just because it was tactically smart, but because it felt like showing off. American crews joked that the Panther didn't need optics. It could just glare at you from 2 kilometers away, and you'd explode out of respect. By mid-1944, these things were everywhere. Normandy reports showed that nearly 40% of German tanks were Panthers, far more than Allied planners expected. And every time one showed up, the atmosphere in a Sherman crew got very quiet, very fast. The standard 75mm gun? It might as well have been a Nerf launcher. The upgraded 76mm was better, but only if you had the courage, or the luck, or the poor life choices, to get within 100 meters. At that range, the Panther's gun, optics, and first shot accuracy meant it usually fired first. And in tank combat, first shot often translates directly to only shot. Stories spread quickly. Entire American platoons getting pinned down by a single Panther. Units reporting a Panther on the field the same way you'd report a hurricane. It's coming, and there's nothing we can do. Even the British intelligence summaries carried the same tone, respectful, slightly nervous, the written equivalent of a raised eyebrow. So when a Sherman crew suddenly managed to blast one open like a cheap tin can in the Ardennes, it wasn't just surprising, it broke the rules everyone thought they understood. And that's where our mysterious shell re-enters the picture. To understand what really happened inside that Panther, we need to talk about the one thing every tank crew in 1944 wished they had more of: tungsten. Not the glamorous kind you see in sci-fi movies. This was the real industrial stuff, the kind that's almost twice as heavy as steel and stubborn enough to chew through armor without flinching. Tungsten carbide doesn't bend, doesn't smear, doesn't politely ask enemy armor to get out of the way. It just keeps going. If steel is a hammer, tungsten carbide is a high-speed nail that never got the memo about slowing down. The Americans looked at this wonder metal and thought, perfect, let's throw it at a Panther. And thus the M93 HVAP round was born, a slender tungsten core wrapped in an aluminum body that acted like a booster seat. When the round left the barrel, the aluminum sabot peeled away, letting the tungsten dart sprint ahead at a ridiculous speed, around 3,400 feet per second. That's about 30% faster than standard tank ammo, and significantly faster than the emotional breakdown a Sherman gunner had when spotting a Panther at long range. What makes HVAP truly nasty, though, isn't just the speed. It's what happens after it punches through armor. Normal rounds enter a tank, maybe break something important, and ideally ruin someone's day. HVAP's tungsten core doesn't behave that politely. Once inside, it tends to shatter into a swarm of white-hot fragments, each one bouncing around the cramped interior like someone dumped a blender full of razor blades into a metal box. These fragments rip through wiring, fuel lines, ammunition racks, and, unfortunately for the crew, anything made of flesh. And when those fragments hit propellant bags or fuel vapor, the results are dramatic. That sudden fireball that blew the Panther's turret sky high in the Ardennes? That's classic HVAP behavior. Armor pierced, interior shredded, ammunition ignited, and the entire tank transformed into a very expensive bonfire. So yes, that strange shiny round the Sherman loader pulled out wasn't magic. It was physics weaponized. A tiny tungsten spear moving so fast and breaking apart so violently that even the strongest German armor of 1944 didn't stand a chance. And this was only the beginning of what HVAP would do once it reached the front. For all its devastating power, HVAP had one tragic flaw. Nobody could get enough of it. Tungsten wasn't just rare, it was good luck finding any rare. Most of the world's supply came from China, and by the time the war hit its stride, that route was choked off. So the U.S. had to ferry the stuff over the Himalayas on a flight path nicknamed the Hump, which sounds adventurous until you realize the pilots described it more like flying into a blender made of mountains and terrible weather. Even when the tungsten made it home, turning it into HVAP cores was its own brand of misery. Machining tungsten carbide required such precise equipment that factories practically needed monks instead of workers, people calm enough not to throw the tools across the room when a core cracked for the third time that day. On paper, production goals looked heroic, 43,000 rounds a month. In reality, a few thousand on a good month, if the industrial gods were feeling generous. The frontline crews felt the shortage immediately. A Sherman could carry 70-plus rounds, but by early 1945, the average tank had received 5 HVAP shells. Not per week, not per month. 5 total, across half a year. 1 round per tank per month, barely enough to make a difference, yet just enough to tempt every commander into dangerous decisions. And that's where the real stress kicked in. Do you fire a precious HVAP at a distant Panther and pray your aim holds? Or wait until the enemy is close enough to smell the paint? Do you waste one on a Panzer IV or save it for the big cat you know is stalking the tree line? Every HVAP shot became a gamble. One shell that could save a crew, turn a fight, or disappear into the snow with nothing to show for it. The first place HVAP truly proved it wasn't just a lab experiment in a shiny crate was Arracourt, France, in the fall of 1944. If you picture a battlefield where both sides can see clearly and maneuver boldly, forget all that. Arracourt was a wet, foggy soup bowl where even experienced tank crews felt like they were driving inside a dishwasher. Panther should have owned this fight. Bad weather usually meant long-range duels were out, and their optics gave them the edge when visibility returned. But the Germans didn't count on American gunners suddenly hitting them from distances that had previously been filed under impossible. One Panther commander allegedly thought he'd been hit by artillery because nothing short of divine intervention should have cracked his mantlet from that far out. Yet there it was, HVAP punching through, lighting up the interior, and dropping Panthers left and right. By the time the fog lifted, the Americans had knocked out far more Panthers than any planner dared hope. Arracourt became the first whisper of a rumor spreading through the German ranks. The Shermans are doing something new, and we don't know what it is. But the real legend building took place a few months later at Krinkelt-Rocheroth during the Battle of the Bulge. Picture a small Belgian town half buried in snow, and a line of M10 tank destroyers dug in behind buildings like hunters in a frozen forest. They had HVAP, just a little, but enough to make things interesting. The Panthers rolled in, confident, looming through the snow with that familiar steel swagger. And the M10 crews waited. 200 yards, 300, close enough to feel the engines in their chests. Then the gunners picked their targets, the mantlet, the narrow seam between turret and hull. The first HVAP round punched through a Panther with a sound described as a hammer hitting a cathedral bell, followed by the entire turret popping upward in a burst of flame. Ammunition cooked off in a chain reaction, 75mm shells firing themselves inside the tank like some deranged fireworks finale. Another Panther took a hit to the turret ring, and the tungsten fragments shredded everything inside before the crew even knew the round had penetrated. German tankers who survived the chaos swore they'd never seen anything like it. Panthers didn't just die, they erupted, burned for hours, and left nothing but blackened hulks steaming in the snow. The town earned a nickname among the Americans, the Panther Graveyard. Then came the duel that made it onto film, the streets of Cologne, March 1945. A lone Panther sat angled at an intersection, already having knocked out two Shermans. It was the kind of setup that usually ends with American crews saying a prayer and writing sad letters home. But this time, an M26 Pershing rolled up, a heavy tank that finally gave the U.S. something that could stare down a Panther without flinching. The cameraman happened to be in the right place at the right time, capturing history in a few jittery frames. The Pershing lined up the shot. The gun barked, and a single HVAP shell from its 90mm cannon slammed into the Panther's turret. The explosion was so violent that even through the black and white footage, you can almost feel the pressure wave. The Panther didn't so much die as detonate, flame bursting from every seam, turret twisting from the force. It became instant Allied propaganda gold, the moment the unstoppable cat was finally outmatched. Across every battlefield where HVAP appeared, the story repeated itself. Panthers that once dominated the field suddenly felt fragile. German crews who had spent months bullying Shermans now found themselves scrambling, confused, shaken by penetrations at ranges they thought were safe. The tungsten rounds didn't just level the playing field, they flipped it, loudly, violently, and with enough fireballs to make any war correspondents weak. HVAP turned theory into shock, fear, and shattered steel. And it was only growing more common as the Allies pressed deeper into Germany. By late 1944, the truth about the Panther was starting to leak out. Quietly at first, like a family secret nobody wants to admit, and then all at once as tanks began dying in ways their designers never intended. On paper, the Panther's armor was supposed to be a masterpiece. In reality, Germany was running out of the alloying elements that made that armor tough. Without enough molybdenum, the steel became brittle, the kind of brittle that reacts to hits not with a heroic clang, but with cracks spiderwebbing across the plate like someone tapped it with a chisel. Crews began reporting something unnerving. They were taking hits that shouldn't have penetrated, yet the inside of the tank suddenly turned into a hailstorm of steel splinters. Even when the armor held, fragments sheared off the inner layer and ricocheted around the compartment. Imagine sitting inside a fortress only to realize the walls are now trying to kill you. Morale doesn't exactly skyrocket. And Panther fuel systems didn't help. Lines leaked just enough vapor to turn the interior into a slow-cooking bomb, while the propellant for the ammunition was sensitive enough that a hard sneeze might have set it off. Combine that with HVAP fragments zipping around the moment a round got through, and the result was a flash fire so fast that German survivors often said they never even saw the flame, just heat, noise, and darkness. What really shook the Panther crews, though, wasn't just the violence of the explosions. It was the distance. They couldn't understand how American tanks, those inferior Shermans, were suddenly punching through front plates from ranges that had always been safe. Rumors spread fast. Some crews swore the Americans had a new gun. Others joked that the Allies had hired wizards. Many simply stopped trusting their armor altogether. Reports from captured officers reveal a similar refrain. We evacuated as soon as the first Sherman appeared. If they had the new ammunition, we had no chance. When the men inside the supposedly superior tank start bailing out before the fight begins, the myth is already dying. And by early 1945, the Panther's legend was cracking just as quickly as its armor. When the war finally ended and the smoke cleared, the Panthers that survived didn't get to retire in glory. The French took dozens of them, hauled them into workshops, and started poking around inside with the enthusiasm of mechanics who already suspect the engine light wasn't lying. What they found wasn't the invincible beast the battlefield legends had promised. Armor plates were brittle, welds were inconsistent, and the fire risk was high enough to make insurance companies weep. The myth looked great in wartime propaganda, but the post-war reports read more like a warranty complaint. The numbers told the same story. The Panther's kill ratios, once whispered like sacred figures, shrank when historians compared actual combat logs. And whenever HVAP showed up, the statistics tilted even harder. It became clear that the tungsten rounds hadn't just evened the playing field. They'd quietly pushed armored warfare into a new era. What came after was the real legacy. HVAP's basic idea, a dense core fired at extreme speed, became the blueprint for everything from British APDS rounds to the modern APFSDS darts made of tungsten or depleted uranium. The whole Cold War turned into a long, expensive argument between better armor and better ways to punch holes in that armor, and it all traces back to those first tungsten cores that startled Panther crews in '44. If there's one lesson buried in the wrecks, it's this: no weapon stays untouchable for long. All it takes is one new idea, a handful of tungsten, and a crew brave enough to pull the trigger, and suddenly the balance of power flips on its head.